Greetings and salutations, all my fellow American sovereigns. This is the Vocational Science Freedom Saturday Night Civics and Sovereignty class. And tonight we are going to be continuing our reading of Conspirators' Hierarchy, which is a book by Dr. John Coleman, which we have been reading from for the past several classes. But till we get to that, I'd like to make a little side rant in the beginning of tonight's class to talk about the idiots that were all about wandering around getting paid by George Soros to cause a little bit of nothing today around this idiot No Kings rally that apparently there was a lot of people that showed up. Well, I'm sure that probably 75 to 80% of them were all paid to be there. They were probably either crisis actors or just paid by some Soros organization. But to make a point, one, all these retards out here talking about, oh, Trump is a danger to our democracy. Well, first off, you don't live in a democracy if you actually are one of the people of the several states of the American Union. You are living in a democracy if you are a person under the jurisdiction and subject to Congress under the 14th Amendment and presumed by all of the contracts that you enter into, the licenses that you enter into, the bonds that you enter into, the pledges that you enter into, the presumptions that the attorney has over you, and all of the registration that you do, and that of your parents, puts you into a situation of which you are a citizen of the United States, which is something entirely different than one of the people of the several states of the American Union. And just to solidify my little rant against these morons, the fact that we are all kings is not going to change just because they want to hold up a bunch of signs and say that there aren't any. So let me educate them. I'm going to be reading from my Law of the Case document, which is where I've accumulated and amassed a lot of case law over 30 years. Most of you guys have this that are in the VSOF. So it's not anything new to you, but just in case you want to know where I'm reading from, this is what I'm reading off of. And I'll probably throw it into the mega file, the link to which is in the show notes for all the classes. So no matter what platform you're watching it on, you can click on the mega link and you'll be able to download this. So, okay. Sovereignty. Rights. At the Revolution, the sovereignty devolved on the people, and they are truly the sovereigns of the country. But they are sovereigns without subjects, with none to govern but themselves. That's Grissom versus Georgia. Okay, that is a 1793 case, and that's never been overturned. So to break that down, the sovereignty devolved on the people. Okay, so we fought a war against a king, and we took our sovereignty from that king. And it says, and they are truly the sovereigns of the country. Nothing else is sovereign in this country. The states are not sovereign. The federal government is not sovereign. And certainly that filthy creation of 1871 called District of Columbia, after the Reconstruction Acts and Civil War, is certainly, absolutely, unequivocally not sovereign. Okay? Only we are. But they are sovereigns without subjects. So we don't have any subjects that we're governing over in our sovereignty, not in the least bit. With none to govern but themselves. Perhaps if all of those communist morons out there actually knew what it meant to govern themselves, maybe they wouldn't be out there. But anyway, next one. The very meaning of sovereignty is that the decree of the sovereign makes law. That's American Banana Company versus United Fruit. And that's important because what is your sovereign decreed law? It's called the law of the domicile. And the law of the domicile is whatever you say it is, as long as you are standing on your allodial lands. So, or even if you're standing in one place and someone, say, I don't know, rams into you, If they run into your physical body, they just made themselves subject to your law because they decided to trespass upon your property, the property of a sovereign. Next one. Sovereignty means that the decree of the sovereign makes law, and foreign courts, okay, which are all these Roman civil law courts flying around out here, cannot condemn influences persuading sovereign to make the decree. So again, it's very much like Grissom versus Georgia. It's whatever the hell you say it is. The people of this state are the successors of its former sovereign, are entitled to all of the rights which formerly belonged to the king by his prerogative. Prerogative means whatever the fuck he wanted to do. Okay? The people of this state, as the successors of its former sovereign, guess what? Get all the powers of the king. Because there's only two ways that you actually gain sovereignty in this entire world. You either take it by war, or you take it, or get it, I should say, through sanguinity, meaning inheritance, meaning as in we the people here and ordain to ourselves and our posterity, meaning the ones that come after us. Right? So that's how we, the American people, got our sovereignty. First by war, and then from our descendants. Okay. Let's skip down a little bit. This government is founded upon compact. Sovereignty was and is in the people. What's the compact? It is the foundational documents. People want to bitch and moan and complain and say, oh, the foundational documents were written by a bunch of slave-owning white men. Okay, and? Doesn't change the fact that they're still law. Doesn't change the fact that that's what established this constitutional republic. So, if you guys want a really good rant about the difference between a republic and a democracy, do yourself a favor and go listen to the Dan Smoot class that he did in 1966 on television. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, Dan Smoot was a former, I believe he was in the FBI as an investigator. And then he took to the airwaves and decided to teach people about things like civics, which is the study of one's personal rights. So it's in the self-governance quadrant as far as the playlists are concerned. It's not too long. It's only like 10 minutes. And I highly suggest that you go watch it and then pass it on to your friends and family so that they understand that you live in a constitutional republic and not a filthy democracy. Okay. Back to our reading. All right. Where we left off in our Conspirators hierarchy was we were talking about the invasion, if you will, of the Beatles, and that was a contrived and created thing by the Tavistock Institute, and the guy that ran around and did the promotion and hyped up rock and roll was a guy named Ginsberg. And we were talking about how his influence was basically free on the airwaves, because when communists go onto communist platforms, usually communists don't charge them for their communist ideas, right? So the electronic media moguls had big hearts when it came to giving free time to these dirty, venomous creatures and their even dirtier products and filthy ideas. And namely, we're talking about rock concerts and drugs, and that they were passing out drugs at rock concerts, namely, the government and those that were supposed to be rounding up drugs, probably like DEA agents and the like, and everybody associated with Tavistock Institute that was assigned to this particular project. Their promotion of horrible garbage spoke volumes, and without abundant help from the print and electronic media, the drug trade could not have spread as rapidly as it did in the late 60s and early 70s, and probably would have been confined to a few small local areas. Ginsberg was able to give several national televised performances extolling the virtues of LSD and marijuana under the guise of new ideas and new cultures developing in the art and music world. Not to be outdone by the electronic media, Ginsberg admirers wrote glowing articles about, quote, this colorful man in the arts and social columns of America's largest newspapers and magazines. There had never been such an across-the-board media free advertising campaign in the history of the newspaper, radio, and television, and it cost the promoters of the Aquarian Conspiracy, NATO, and the Club of Rome not one red cent. It was all absolutely free advertising for LSD, only thinly disguised as art and culture. One of Ginsberg's closest friends, Kenny Love, published a 5-page report in the New York Times. In his accordance with the methodology used by Tavistock and the Stanford research, if something is to be promoted which the public has not yet been fully brainwashed to accept, then have someone write an article covering all sides of the subject matter. The other method is to have a live television talk shows in which a panel of experts promote the product or the idea under the pretext of, quote unquote, discussing it. There are point and counterpoint, both pro and cons participants, airing their support or opposition. This reminds me very much of the beginning of talk shows on TV. People like, the ones that come to my mind are like Donahue and Oprah and then the fanatical idiots. Like, I don't even need to name them. You already know what I'm thinking of. But this whole idea of, we're going to discuss this issue. Okay, well, when both sides of the point and counterpoint are working for the same institutes, are all buddy, outside the studio, then you're not having an honest discussion about anything. It's just more brainwashing. But to continue, when it is all over, the subject to be promoted has been dined into the public mind. While this was new in the early 1970s, today is standard practice on which talk shows thrive. Yes, exactly, Ibid. Love's 5-page pro-LSD, pro-Ginsberg article was duly printed in the New York Times. Had Ginsberg tried to buy the same amount of space in an advertisement, would have cost him at least $50,000. But Ginsberg didn't have to worry. Thanks to his friend Kenny Love, Ginsberg got the massive advertisement all for free. With newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post under the control of the Committee of 300, this kind of free advertising is given to any subject matter, and more especially to those promoting decadent lifestyles, drugs, hedonism, anything that will confuse the American people. After the trial run with Ginsberg and LSD, it became standard Club of Rome practice to call upon major newspapers in America to give free advertising on demand to people and ideas they were promoting. Right. And who controls the Associated Press? The Rothschilds. And where do all of the quote-unquote news organizations get their talking points from? The Associated Press. So one turbo Jew decides to say, this is what the news is for the day, and then everybody in the world just follows it. Right. That's real journalism now, isn't it? But to continue. Worse yet, or better yet, depending on the viewpoint, United Press, UP, picked up Kenny Love's free advertising for Ginsberg and LSD and teletexted it to hundreds of newspapers and magazines around the country under the guise of news story. Right. Exactly what I was saying. Even such highly respectable establishment magazines as Harper's Bazaar and Time, I don't know if those are exactly respectable establishment magazines, but whatever, made Mr. Ginsberg respectable. If a nationwide campaign of this magnitude were presented to Ginsberg and the promoters of LSD by an advertising agency, the price tag would have run into at least $1 million in terms of $1970. Today, the price tag would be a lot more than he's saying. Because remember, everyone, this book was written in 1992. So we're going to have to take hyperinflation into consideration, right? So no wonder that I refer to the news media as jackals. Well, right. They're just nothing but absolute controlled propaganda since the modernization of the Smith-Mundt Act, which was done under Obama. And I highly suggest to everybody that doesn't know, go Google the Smith-Mundt Act. The modernization of this. Well, do it both, because you want to know what they were changing. So the Smith-Mundt basically got rid of or said, no, you can't do propaganda here in America, and the government can't use the media as propaganda. No, basically, and nor can anyone else. The news media and the media itself, which would nowadays include all forms of social media, were not allowed to be used as propaganda. Okay. Obama got rid of that, obviously, because he wanted to perpetuate his Muslim hordes that were then doubled under Obama. And they always wanted to make sure that they could say whatever they wanted to in the media, and they could attack whatever presidential candidate that they wanted without question, so that the Canaanites would control everything. Everything that you hear, nothing's going to say a damn thing to you unless it's being spoken out of the mouthpiece of some Luciferian Canaanite. And that's where we're at now, except for the platforms that we can still get away with of actually having shows that are not controlled by said, like FTJ Media, and for the moment, still Rumble and Odyssey. We'll see how long they last. And of course, obviously, we can always talk as much as we want to on our mega server, because no one's getting to that unless, of course, they possibly whack Kim.com, which I'm not trying to make things happen, but I'm just saying, if there's one person, well, there's a few people, but Kim.com is definitely one of them that I'm sure they would like to not have around anymore. So anyway, to continue, I suggest that we try to find any media outlet to do an expose on the Federal Reserve Board, which is what I did. I took my article, which was a good expose of the greatest swindle on earth, to every major newspaper, radio and television station, magazine house, and several talk show hosts. A few made promises that sounded good. They would definitely air the article and have me discuss it. Give them about a week and they would get back to me. Not one of them ever did, nor did my article ever appear in the pages of their newspapers and journals. It was as if a blanket of silence had been thrown over me and the subject I was endeavoring to promote, and indeed, that was precisely what happened. Well, right. I think they tried to ban G. Edward Griffin's Creature from Jekyll Island book for quite a long period of time as well. So, to continue, without massive media hype and without almost around-the-clock coverage, the hippie beatnik rock drug cult would have never gotten off the ground. It would have remained an idolized oddity. The Beatles, with their twanging guitars, silly expressions, drug language, and weird clothes, would have not amounted to a hill of beans. Instead, because the Beatles were given saturation coverage by the media, the United States has suffered one cultural shock after another. And he discussed exactly what culture shocks are in the last previous readings. The men buried in the think tanks and research institutions whose names and faces are still not known, but to a few people, would make sure that the press played its part. Conversely, the media's important role in not expressing the power behind the future culture shocks made certain that the source of the crisis was never identified. And we all know who that source is. Thus, was our society driven mad through psychological shocks and stress. Quote unquote, driven mad is taken from Tavistock's training manual from its modest beginnings in 1921. Tavistock was ready in 1966 to launch a major, irreversible cultural revolution in America, which has not yet ended. Well, let me think back to 92. Had it really ended in 92? Probably not. I think very soon there's going to be quite the quick ending of this culture shock. I think there are two generations, basically the two latest ones, that are coming up that are thoroughly capable of seeing straight through the bullshit. And they're very aware of who their enemy is. They are more informed than any other culture or I should say, sorry, not culture, any other generation before them, because they have more access to everything and they know how to tweak it very quickly, right? Because they grew up with computers, they grew up with a smartphone, they know how to do all these things very, very quickly. They know how to weed through stuff fast. And they're all coming to the conclusion that there's definitely a conspiracy. And as the good doctor here talks about it, he calls it the Aquarian conspiracy is part of it. Now, he's talking about it in a reference to the Aquarian age and moving culture into a direction which is not going to be good for anybody, but only serves to perpetuate the New World Order and to perpetuate a one world government, to continue to constrict and constrict the freedoms, the rights, and all of your capabilities to have free speech, distribute that free speech, and be able to make any meaningful change, whether it be in the law, like what we do at the Vocational Science of Freedom, or whether it be in any other way as far as the capacity to alter the trajectory of a culture. They want all of that gone. So when they speak, that's what the sheep do, right? No independent thinking, none of it. So, and once they get their AI controlled digital panopticon slavery system 3.0 set up, it may be too late to stop them. Aside from all out war, which I think once one nation sparks off, and my guess would probably be that it's going to be the United States of America, I would see every other nation in the world doing exactly the same thing, meaning the people thereof. I think the Chinese people would rise up instantly. I don't think they'd have a hesitation. I think Tiananmen Square was very, very soft as far as the people are concerned. I mean, that won't hurt it won't hold a candle to what the true rage of the Chinese people will be if it's ever unleashed. And the only way it's ever going to be unleashed is if they believe that other people around the world are with them, meaning like they already started it. So, hey, we might as well join them too, kind of thing. The Chinese have always been a culture that very much follow. Like your average Chinese mentality is very much that of following. Always has been. They were ruled by dynasties and emperors for thousands of years. Oh, good point, Spectre. Spectre said the question is, how are they going to know? Well, yeah. I think there's still ways to probably leak it in there somewhere. But you're right. It's probably getting more and more crushed as far as the capacity to get anything into China. And the better that they get at their AI, the more powerful that's going to become. And of course, that's going to be a problem. But that's why we have to here make sure that that never happens. And obviously do not, under any circumstances, take digital ID. I don't care what they threaten you with. Because we'll turn into China if, just keep getting boiled and we keep allowing for tiptoe totalitarianism. That's how it works. And they do it slowly so that you don't get shocked and say, hey, wait a second, what's going on here? And decide to, I don't know, exercise your Second Amendment right and get rid of some treasonous fucks. That's why they do it very quietly and very slowly. But they're getting to the point where they don't care anymore. And that's when they get dangerous. And that's always been when the violence is unleashed. And the violence is always unleashed. Well, I shouldn't say always. The violence is pretty much through all of history started by the state. Okay? Every once in a very, very great while, it gets started by the people. Like, well, I can't even think of one right off the top of my head because they're so far and few between. I was about to misspeak and say America, but that wasn't even true either. I mean, if you have any idea or knowledge of the Intolerable Acts, if you have any idea as to what the British were doing, trust me, you wouldn't think that the American people were the ones that started the violence because you'd know better. But yeah, it's usually always the state that decides to fire the first shot. And in colonial America, you could have basically, you should consider that the Boston Massacre. That was basically the first shot fired. So it only got worse from there. So I don't know when people are going to start shooting around here. I tell everybody to be 100% prepared for it. And yes, Spectre, lucky I don't know how to operate or own a bulldozer either, because I might just turn it into a tank. And if no one else knows what Spectre and I are talking about, just go get online and type in the word killdozer. You will learn all you need to learn about what one determined man can do when he decides to do it, when his will is stronger than that of the oppressors. So, as man once said, the minds of the oppressed are the most powerful weapon of the oppressors. And whatever keeps you down is their most powerful weapon. And so, in contradistinction to that, whatever raises you up is your most powerful weapon. Whether it be listening to the Vocational Science of Freedom Saturday night civics and sovereignty classes and passing them on, whether it be talking to your friends and family about what you learn here or any place else for that matter regarding what is coming down the pipe, that should inspire you. That should then inspire others to get to know each other and maybe form groups. Back in the days, it used to be called things like, I don't know, local assemblies, the Court of 100, grand juries, militias, all these things you don't hear about anymore. Those were the organizational structures of which we, the sovereignty of America, stayed sovereign. It's also how we stayed informed, aside from pamphlets being given out in a bunch of bars in New England from time to time by good old Sam and the Sons of Liberty. Now we have memes. Now we have our sharing channels, right? This is how we're doing it now. And it's important. It's important to continue to raise oneself up and not continually allow yourself to continually be oppressed and depressed and demoralized. Because all of those three things are a conscious choice when it comes down to it. You can say, no, fuck that. Take your filth and get away from me. Or, I don't believe in what this guy is ranting about. Or I wish to be around people that are on the same mission as me. And that is the most important thing. Find people that are on the same mission as you. Find people that are curious. Find particularly young people, right? Find the young people that are curious, that you can give them some information. Don't try to red pill them or black pill them like the second you meet them. That's a horrible idea. But give them some classes. Give them some things that are easy to understand, that ease people into these subjects. And I have plenty of them on the Vocational Science of Freedom. I would say probably one of the best ones would be the Presumptions class, the USA, the Republic is the house that no one lives in. I think the reading of the Zero Hedge article was a great introduction. So gently, because when you go to teach someone, let's put it this way, when you go to educate someone, the root word of education is eduque. It means to raise up, to lift up, because that's what you're trying to do. Not only for the young people, but anybody that happens to be around you, because you're going to need people in your foxhole. Because the people in your foxhole are going to be the ones that are going to help protect you and your property against those who would try to raid your foxhole, which is going to be enemies. I don't want to say too numerous to count, because I don't mean in population wise. I mean in kind, right? There's a lot of different kinds of enemies out there. So make sure that you have good people in your foxhole, and make sure that they know what you know. Make sure that you've raised them up, okay? All right, so to continue. All right, thus softened up, our nation was now deemed ripe for the introduction of drugs, which was to rival the Prohibition era in scope and the huge amounts of money to be made. Dope Incorporated, anyone? This too was an integral part of the Aquarian conspiracy. The proliferation of drug usage was one of the subjects under study at the Science Policy Research Unit at Tavistock, Sussex University facility. It was known as the Future Shocks Center. And remember, you talked about future shocks again previously. A title given to so-called future-oriented psychology designed to manipulate whole population groups to induce future shocks. It was the first of several such institutions set up by Tavistock. Future shocks is described as a series of events which come so fast that the human brain cannot absorb the information. Now, I did a rant on this in one of the previous classes, but I'm just going to do a very much shorter, condensed version of this right here. Okay, so the future shocks are like this. So you have news cycles, and you have this thing happen today, this thing happened today, this thing happened today. Okay, and then the next day, what do they hit you with? Oh, there's this crazy thing happening, and this crazy thing, and this thing, and this thing, and that thing, and this thing. And all of the little minions are all pushing all of this shock and awe, which was literally the name of the first bombing campaign in the Gulf War, but everybody probably knows that. What does your brain do? It can't keep up. Okay. So you can't stop and do critical thinking about, say, I don't know, the first news story that you got hit with on Monday morning. By the time Friday rolls around, you don't even know what the fuck happened on Monday morning. You don't know what happened through the rest of the week because you can't differentiate in your mind what is and what is not important. And trust me, the vast majority out there of everything that everybody's yelling about is not important. So, to continue. As I said earlier, science has shown that there are clearly marked limits to the amount of changes and the nature of them that the mind can deal with. After continuous shocks, the large targeted population group discovers that it does not want to make choices anymore. Apathy takes over, often preceded by mindless violence, such as is characteristic of the Los Angeles street gangs, serial killers, rapists, and child kidnappers. And I would expound upon that to adrenochrome and human trafficking and now fentanyl and finish off your list. Such groups become easy to control and will docilely follow orders without rebelling, which is the subject of the exercise. Future shocks, says SPRU, is defined as physical and psychological distress arising from the excess load on the decision-making mechanism of the human mind. That's explained better than even what I just did. That's exactly what it is in a single sentence. Okay? Now, strangely enough, to elaborate on this, I want to make another point about this idea of future shocks. Technology itself has been doing that to us for, well, the last several hundred years. Okay? And if you think about it, say, let's go back to, let's say, 1800s, right? Okay, so during the 1800s, the two biggest major technological inventions were the railroad and arguably the telegram. Okay, so all of a sudden you communicate across hundreds of miles, damn near instantaneously. I mean, certainly instantaneously compared to what they were communicating as, which was called riding on a horse or by train. But both of those technological advancements came on either ends of the century. Okay, human beings had a very, very long time to allow it to absorb in, to say, okay, there's this new thing. Okay, what can we do with it? How is it affecting our society? Okay. Then as you move along and you get more and more into the Industrial Revolution and all of these other things that start popping up all over the place, and then you have tractors, and then you have cars, and then you have all kinds of various different machines that do X, Y, Z. And then eventually you get to electricity, thanks to Tesla, and so on and so forth, and trolley cars. And now there's all these things moving around. Okay, so as that sped up, humans had a really hard time, like, understanding it from a biological, ancient, connected brainstem, if you will, right? It takes a long time for that to kind of soak in. And now, and my point of bringing all this up is that now the technological advances happen like every year. There's something that comes out that boggles the mind that has been invented. So it's harder and harder for your moral understanding to keep up with it. Okay? That's what I'm getting at. So, to continue. Okay, that is Tavistock jargon lifted straight from Tavistock manuals, which they don't know I have. That's funny. Just as an overloaded electrical circuit, will activate a trip switch, so do humans trip out, which is a syndrome that medical science is now only beginning to understand. Although John Rawlings Rees conducted experiments in this field as far back as the 1920s, it can be appreciated such a targeted group is ready to trip out and take drugs as a means of escape from the pressures of so many choices having to be made. This is how drug usage was spread so rapidly through America's Beat generation. What started with the Beatles and sample packages of LSD has grown into a flood tide of drug use, which is swamping America. The drug trade is controlled by the Committee of 300 from the top down. The drug trade started with the British East India Company and was closely followed by the Dutch East India Company. I think he's missing a big one. I would also say that obviously the Sassoons were a huge influence in that when they decided to actually, have the opium wars with China. Now, not to say that the East India Trading Companies, both Dutch and British, weren't part of that as well, but I think he's also missing something else there that hardly anybody knows about. There was a company that was above both of them. It was called the United Company of Merchants. That was your global Luciferian, total take it over, let's perpetuate the law merchant across the planet by cannon fire that there ever was. Okay. So it was the umbrella corporation of all umbrella corporations, if you want to think of it that way, right? And of course, who ran it? Oh, obviously, came out of Holland, Dutch doing their thing, right? And who controlled them, right? Where'd they come from? Venetian black nobility. So take it back logically. All right, to continue. Both were controlled by the Council of 300. The list of names of members and stakeholders of the BEIC read like something out of Derbert's Peerage. Derbert's? De Beers. No. What is that? I don't think he spelled that right. Or at least or maybe I'm not pronouncing it right. Wait, hold on. I thought it was Burke's Peerage. Maybe it was named something else back then. Okay. Anyway, I'll continue. Anyway, what I'm trying to figure out here. Okay, so Burke's Peerage is a website you can go to, and Burke's Peerage connects all of the major bloodlines of all of the world. Okay, all the kings and queens, fucking all of it, all right? But I'm thinking this must be another one, or possibly what Burke's Peerage was possibly called in 92. I don't know. But anyway. So anyway, that's what it is. If you guys want to go check it out. To continue. All right. BEIC established the China Inland Mission, whose job it was to get the Chinese peasants, or coolies, as they were called, addicted to opium. Okay, he is talking about the opium wars. This created the market for opium, which the BEIC then filled. In much the same way the Committee of 300 used the Beatles to popularize social drugs with the youth of America and the Hollywood in crowd. Ed Sullivan was sent to England to become acquainted with the first Tavistock Institute rock group to hit the shores of the United States. Sullivan then returned to the United States to draft the strategy for the electronic media on how to package and sell the group. Figures. Without the full cooperation of the electronic media and Ed Sullivan, in particular, the Beatles and their quote-unquote music would have died on the vine. Instead, our national life and the character of the United States was changed forever. Now that we know, it is all too clear how successful the Beatles' campaign to proliferate the use of drugs became. The fact that the Beatles had their music and lyrics written for them by the Theo Ordona was concealed from public view. Yeah, I didn't even know who that guy was. The prime function to the quote-unquote the Beatles was to be discovered by teenagers who were then subjected to a nonstop barrage of Beatles music until they became convinced that they liked the sound and adopted it, along with all that accompanied it. Just a little help from my friends right here. I.e. illegal substances we call drugs created a whole new class of young Americans in the precise mold obtained by the Tavistock Institute. Sorry, ordained. Yeah, they definitely ordained a lot of this shit. Tavistock had created a highly visible, quote-unquote, new type to act as their drug runners. The China Inland Mission, Christian missionaries, would not have fitted in with the 1960s. Quote-unquote, new type is social scientist jargon, or what is meant was the Beatles created new social patterns. The first and foremost being to normalize and popularize the use of drugs, new tastes in clothes, and hairstyles which really distinguish them from older generations, as was intended by Tavistock. And it is important to note the deliberate fragmentation during the language used by Tavistock. The teenagers never once dreamed that all the quote-unquote different things that they aspired to wear were the product of older scientists working in think tanks in England and Stanford research. True. How mortified they would be had they been found and discovered that most of their quote-unquote cool habits and expressions were deliberately created for their use by a group of old, crusty social scientists. True. And, yeah, aloha. China might still be pissed about the Opium War, and rightfully so, right? They should be. I think the Chinese should wake up and realize that it wasn't white people that did that to them. Maybe they could focus their anger towards the proper enemy. But anyway, to continue. Okay, so the role of media. So I'm going to skip a little bit of this here. Drug use is now been accepted by every day in America. True. The descendants of the British East India Company were delighted with their success of their drug-pushing program. Their disciplines became adept at the use of LSD, so conveniently made available by patrons of the drug trade like Aldous Huxley, courtesy of the highly respected Sandoz Company of Switzerland and financed by the great Warburg banking dynasty. The new quote-unquote wonder drug was promptly distributed at all rock concerts and on college campuses in free sample packages. The question that begs to be asked is, what was the FBI doing while all this was going on? I'm sure they were just playing along. All right, so I'm going to skip a little bit this down. I kind of wanted to just get past the drugs and aspect of this Beatles stuff. Okay, Bush administration. Yeah, the drug war. Yeah, because he started the drug war, which was a promulgation of what they knew they were doing. So then they started the war on drugs. And then later on, Clinton came in with what was called the Omnibus Crime Bill, which was the 3 strikes that you were out rule. And it was all mostly based upon drug charges, right? So they said, oh, it's a felony to have so much marijuana. And then you get 3 felonies, and then you spend the rest of your life in prison. Okay, why did they do that? It wasn't because they didn't know how to get rid of the drugs or stop distributing them, because they were the ones distributing them. No, it came from the idea that what they wanted to do the most was they wanted to set up a prison industrial complex in this nation so that then they could pass the Omnibus Crime Bill, and so that all the people would then populate the prisons so that they would have free slave labor within the geographical boundaries of the United States of America, so that companies like, I don't know, Victoria's Secret didn't have to go too far to get their bras made. And there's whole papers on this, by the way. You just go look for papers regarding the prison industrial complex, and particularly labor papers based upon the prison industrial complex. And you'll see the numbers. I mean, they're right there. It's not like they're hiding them. So that's why they did this. So they could enslave American people and create the largest prison population per capita out of, I think, any nation in the world. That might be going too far, but I think there was a time of which actually the United States was the highest one, meaning per capita, we have the most people in prisons. Now, why is that? Okay, the prisons are really, really nice. but there's more people in there than ever. Why? Because they're running them through slave labor. And everything that the prisoners buy inside, that is, jacked up in price. They have to pay for their phone calls. So everybody gets a piece, right? So what were they doing? They were throwing a bunch of Americans in Wackenhut and Prison Corp of America and saying, let's see how many different ways we can extract off of them, right? Not to mention that they were extracting and getting paid by the United States Federal Corporation, and this was a long time ago, but about $1,700 per week to house them, right? So your estate that's being administered by and through the attorneys from registration at the foundling hospitals, the United States Federal Corporation says, okay, we'll pay you, Wackenhut and Prison Corp in America, or any other state prisons for that matter, we'll pay you this amount of money to house them. Okay. So take that amount, and I'm sure it's much higher now. I don't know what the exact amount is, but again, look up one of these prison industrial complex papers with the numbers in them, and you'll find them. And yes, exactly, Spy Hunter. You'll see exactly how big incarceration business is, and just exactly why they don't ever want to get rid of any of these quote unquote laws, which of course aren't laws at all. They're private equity statutes, acts, ordinances, and codes to administer abandoned infants. That's all they are. That's all they will ever be. They're not common law, nor will they ever be. And that's what the attorney does. They create as many isms, as many situations as they possibly can to get as much of that 33.33% out of your ass as they possibly can. And this whole thing is just a part of it. Okay. Now, I want you to throw in all the entire aspect of the court systems and all the bonds that are created, which don't even get me started. That's way, 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 way more than what the incarceration itself happens with. Okay. But if you want to join the Vocational Science Freedom, and we'll teach you how to literally look up the bonds in a criminal court case and then go and get them canceled. You watch what that judge does when you go into the court next time and say, Your Honor, the bonds in this case have been canceled. He'll blow a gasket. He might pull out a gun and shoot the district attorney. But in the least bit, he'll dismiss the case and probably strangle the district attorney. You won't see it. It'll happen in chambers, but trust me, that's what will happen because we've actually witnessed this. So yeah, we have ways to get rid of the bonds, because if you get rid of the bonds, you get rid of the court case. And the reason is because the attorney creates the bonds by power of attorney. Of course, they don't tell you that. But we've shown this in the VSOF. We've shown actual documents that we've got back by state open records request acts where you get the bonding information from these filthy private for-profit courts with their 501c3 fucking slush funds of the judges, those black robe priests of hell that are sitting up there creating law from the bench, all guilty of barratry. Right? We have the documents. And it shows that they create the bonds by power of attorney. Huh. Where'd you get power of attorney from? Oh, that's right. Because everybody's presumed to be an infant. Got it. Right? So anyway, to continue. There's much more talk about environment these days. And while it mostly refers to green surroundings, pure rivers and fresh air, there is another equally important environment, namely the drug environment. The environment of our lifestyle has become polluted. Our thinking has become polluted. And I would say a lot of people's brains are also polluted with a lot of microplastics, but to continue. Our ability to control our destiny has become polluted. We are confronted by changes that pollute our thinking to the extent that we do not know what to make of all of it. The quote-unquote environment of change is crippling the nation. We appear to have so little control that it has produced anxiety and confusion. Now we look to group solutions instead of individual solutions to our problems. Wow, that's okay. That's saying a lot. What is the VSOF about, everybody? It's about understanding that you are sovereign. No one is coming to save your ass. No one has any duty to save your ass. Except perhaps your parents, but they only have the duty to teach you how to take care of your own ass. And in what way? In the quadrants: self-governance, self-reliance, self-awareness, and self-defense. It's your problem. It's not your neighbor's problem. It's not the government's problem. It's not anybody's problem at the Vocational Science of Freedom, right? It's your problem. So learn to be sovereign. Learn how to master the quadrants and stop taking benefits. Because if you take a benefit from your own estate, you're abstaining from being the heir. It's called beneficium abstinente. Just everybody should remember that. And go look it up. But to continue. All right. In this prolific rise in drug usage is playing a leading role. The strategy is a deliberate one, devised by the new science scientists, the social engineers and tinkerers, aimed at the most vulnerable of all areas, our self-image, or how we perceive ourselves, which leads us eventually to become like sheep being led to the slaughter. We have become confused by the many choices we have to make, and we have become apathetic. We are manipulated by unscrupulous men without ever being aware of it. This is particularly true of the drug trade, and we are now in the transition stage where we can be set up for a change from the present constitutional form of government, which has taken a giant step forward under the Bush administration. Right. The same son of a bitch who said, the Constitution is just a piece of paper. Well, that's true, unless you have somebody enforcing it. While there are still those who still persist in the face of all the evidence to the contrary and saying, it can't happen in America. The fact is, it has already happened. Yes, and it happened very much so in the Civil War, 1871, the Reconstruction Acts, which I do intend to do an entire class on because so very few people know anything about what happened during Reconstruction and how insidious that was. It was absolutely ridiculous. So, Spy, I think Texas happens to have, I don't know, either attracted a lot of the personal industrial complex people or maybe the state was just more open to it. I don't know. You're right. Yeah, Sniper's Ghost, you're also right. Indiana as well. Those are two very big states that just put up a hell of a lot of prisons and kind of racked in a lot of money for it. So anyway, I don't know exactly the reasons, but I'm sure there happens to be one. Probably because Bush was from Texas. The Bushes are from Texas. That's what I'm guessing. If I had to just take a shot in the dark. Indiana, that one, I'm not too sure about. All right, to continue. Our will to resist events, not to our liking, has become steadily eroded and undermined. We will resist, some of us say, but not so many of us will do that, and we will be in the minority. The drug trade, saying that, okay, most people would, okay, when people say, look at this, and you're like, oh, we're in the minority. Yeah, great. I mean, I knew that when I was born. White people are the minority of the planet. However, we shouldn't be the minority in our own fucking countries. So, if there's a whole entire scheme to kill us, particularly in America, I would say it might be a good idea to wake up and realize that we're not the minority yet. If we ever do become so, we might be permanently there. And maybe it's a good idea, to resist. And then again, the resistance took what? 3%? 5%, 5, something like that. In between 3 and 5% of the population to win the Revolutionary War. So I don't want to hear it. To continue, the drug trade has insidiously changed our environment. The alleged quote unquote war on drugs is a farce. It does not exist in qualitative measures to make the slightest difference to the descendants of the British East India Company. Combined with computerization, we are almost fully brainwashed, robbed of our ability to resist forced changes, which brings us to another environment. People control. I think, what'd you say, Spy? Propaganda wins wars or something like that you said earlier? Yeah. Also known as personal information control, without which governments cannot play their numbers game. This would be things like metadata, what you watch, the fact that they're listening to you on your phone, unless, of course, you don't have a smartphone like me, who your friends are, what their phone numbers are, kind of get the point. So anyway, as matters stand, we the people have absolutely no way of knowing just what government does or does not know about us. Well, welcome to the NSA watch list. Government computer files are not subject to scrutiny by the public at large. We do foolishly believe that personal information is sacrosanct. Remember, in every society, there are rich and powerful families who control law enforcement agencies. Yeah. And what are armed cops anyway? They're exactly the standing armies that the founding fathers warned us about. That's all they are. There's Praetorian, enforcing Roman civil law against infants who are too stupid to get out of the system. That's all they are. That's all they'll ever be. All right, to continue. Do not think that if these families wanted to find out about us, they could not do so. These are the families who often have a member in the Committee of 300. Take Kissinger, for instance, who's now dead, thank God, who has his own private dossiers on hundreds of thousands of people, not only in the U.S., but all over the world. Are we on Kissinger's enemy list? Well, I'm sure everybody here is on the NSA watch list. Is this far-fetched? Not at all. Take P2 Masonic and Committee Monte Carlo, who have such lists which run into tens of thousands of names. Incidentally, Kissinger is one of them. There are other quote-unquote private intelligence agencies, such as Intel, whom we shall meet later. And I think he said, or we read a few episodes back, that that Interpol was, I think he said either started by the Rockefellers or started by the Rothschilds. I can't remember which he said, but one of the two. And that kind of shocked me. I was like, really? Like Interpol was created by like that whole thing? Like, all right. So yes, as they're private, or as if there is ever a question that they are private, to put it this way, they have their own Dun and Bradstreet numbers. Okay, right? They are their own corporations, right? So go look them up. If you don't know what DNB, or if you've never been to dnb.com, it is quite the enlightening website. Okay. When you go into dnb.com, you can look up what's called someone's Dun and Bradstreet number. This shows you that they're a corporation and that they're in good standing with this company called Dun and Bradstreet, which has been around for a very, very long period of time and is located in England. And if you want to know if something's a corporation, or if you want to know their DUNS number, or if you want to look up and get their DUNS report, which will tell you more than you ever want to know about them, feel free to do it against your local cop shop. In fact, do yourself one better. Feel free to do it against your favorite public defender, or your favorite district attorney, or your favorite judge, or your favorite, I don't know, court system, because they're all on Dun and Bradstreet. Okay, might want to go look them up. Throw that in their face when you go to court next time. Your Honor, is this court's Dun and Bradstreet, 52617? Is that correct? Anyway, to continue. There is no check of what goes on nor comes off these ferries, as there is no border between France and Monaco. Drugs are more especially heroin, partly processed opium, flows through the open borders of Monaco into laboratories in France, or else, if it has already been processed into heroin, it goes directly to the distributors. Right. The Grimaldi family, sounds Italian, has been in the drug smuggling business for centuries. Because Prince Rainier got greedy and began skimming heavily and would not desist after 3 warnings, his wife, Princess Grace, was murdered in a car quote-unquote accident. Sound familiar, like Princess Di? Rainier underestimated the power of the committee of which he is a member. The Rover car in which she was traveling had the brake fluid chambers tampered with in such a way that each time the brakes were depressed, fluid was released in measured amounts, until by the time the car reached the most dangerous of several hairpin bends, there was no stopping power, and it sailed off a stone wall, hitting on the ground 50 feet below in a stinking smash. Exactly. These people will whack their own anytime they want to. There's so many examples of this, I don't even want to get into it, but when one of them thinks that they're above the rest of them, I don't know, recently it was, that's right, Prince Andrew decided to step down, right? Why'd that happen? I don't know. Probably pissed off the wrong people. Probably was talking too much smack to the king. Probably. I don't know. But yeah. They get rid of you in one way or another, or they tell you to step down. And if you don't, then they'll just really get rid of you. That's been their modus operandi for, well, forever. Since there has been a Luciferian... Let me go back farther than that. Since there has been Atonists in this planet, that has been their modus operandi. So to continue. Everything possible was done by the Committee of 300 operatives to conceal the truth about the murder of Princess Grace. To this day, the rover car remains in the custody of French police, shrouded under cover on a trailer which no one is allowed to approach, let alone examine. The signal for the execution... Okay, I don't need to know all this. All right, so continue. Institutions which control is exercised, yet we successfully overcome all problems. Why, then, is it impossible to defeat a well-defined enemy? Far smaller and weaker than Germany, given the immense improvised weapons and surveillance equipment we have today. The real reason is that the drug problem is not eradicated is because it is being run by the highest families in the entire world as part of a coordinated, gigantic, money-making machine. No shit. And of course, aside from the quote-unquote illegal drugs, the legal ones make way more money, okay? Like, in magnitudes that are unfathomable. And that's off to the Rockefellers. Rockefellers destroying the healthcare system, bringing in the idea of quackery, getting rid of all of natural medicines, making everything out of petroleum, and then controlling all of the HMOs and all of the doctors and all of the literature of which they follow, because when they get out of medical school, they're too stupid to realize there's a whole bunch of stuff they were never taught, and on and on and on and on and on. Right? The legal drugs are the ones that kill more people, I'm sure, than the illegal ones. Yeah, for the exception of specific ones like, say, like fentanyl. Okay, I'll grant it that one has a higher death rate. But as far as the totality of the society is concerned, all right, it's always the legal ones that are pumped into you by some supposed intellectual idiot wearing a white lab coat, right? That you pay him thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to put into you. But to continue. In 1930, British capital invested in South America greatly exceeded capital investment in British domains. Graham, an authority on British investment abroad, stated that British investment in South America exceeded £1 trillion. Remember, this was 1930. What? Oh my God. And £1 trillion was a staggering sum of money in those days. That's true. What was the reason for such heavy investment in South America? In a word, it was drugs. The plutocracy controlling British banks held the purse strings and then, as now, pull up the most respectable facade to cover their true business. Okay, so that would be the British Central Bank, which is, of course, run by the Rothschilds. No one ever caught them with dirtied hands. They always had front men. Well, a couple of the banks got caught not all that long ago. I think BHS got caught laundering a ridiculous amount of drug money. But anyway, nothing ever happened to them, so it's not like it makes a difference. But at least they screwed up enough, or they had too much chutzpah, or to think they could always get away with it, and they didn't, and then everybody found out. But again, if enforcement doesn't happen, it's like, who cares, right? So anyway, then as now, the connections within the drug trade were tenuous at best. No one was ever able to lay a finger on the respectable and quote-unquote noble banking families of Britain. Of course not. Whose members are on the Committee of 300. There's great significance in that only 15 members of Parliament were the controllers of that vast empire, of which the most prominent were Sir Charles Barry and the Chamberlain family. These overlords of finance were busy in places like Argentina, Jamaica, and Trinidad, which became big money-making spinners for them through the drug trade. In these countries, British plutocrats kept, quote-unquote, the locals at bar subsistence levels, hardly above slavery. The fortunes attracted from the drug trade in the Caribbean were vast. The plutocrats hid behind faces like Trinidad Leaseholds Limited, but the real meat, then as now, was drugs. This is true of today, where we find that Jamaica's gross national product is made up almost entirely of sales of ganja, a very potent form of marijuana. The mechanisms for handling the ganja trade was set up by David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger under the title, quote, Caribbean Basin Initiative. Up until a relatively short time ago, the true history of the China opium trade was quite unknown, having been as well covered up as it is possible to do. Many of my former students in the days when I was lecturing would come and ask me why the Chinese were so fond of smoking opium. They were puzzled, as are many still today, over contradictory accounts of what had actually taken place in China. Most thought it was merely a case of the Chinese workers buying up opium on an open market and smoking it, or going to some of the thousands of opium dens and forgetting their terrible existence for a while. The truth is that the supply of opium to China was a British monopoly, an official monopoly of the British government and official British policy. Now, to make a side point on this, you want to talk about addiction. Okay, so the British first, basically, got addicted to Chinese tea, like the hoity-toity ones, and then they got everybody else addicted to the tea, and then China said, we're not selling any more tea. And the British hoity-toity said, fuck you, yes you are, and China said, no, we're not. And so that's how that little spat got started. And trust me, the dragon families are well aware of who did this to them. Okay, maybe not so much the Chinese people, but anyway, to continue. The Indo-British opium trade in China was one of the best kept secrets, around which many misleading legends grew up, such as Clive of India and the tales of daring do by the British Army in India for the glory of the empire, so well written by Rudyard Kipling, and tales of tea clippers racing across the oceans with their cargoes of China tea for the high society drawing rooms of Victorian England. Exactly what I was just talking about. In reality, the history of British occupation of India and Britain's opium wars are some of the most dastardly blots on Western civilization. True. Almost 13% of the income of India under British rule was derived from the sale of good quality Bengal opium to the British-run opium distributors in China. The Beatles of the day, the China Inland Mission, had done a great job in proliferating the use of opium among the poor Chinese laborers, coolies as they were called. These addicts did not suddenly materialize out of thin air, any more than did teenage addicts in the U.S. The point to remember is that both were created. In China, a market for opium was first created and then filled by opium from Bengal. Sorry, I'm not pronouncing that correctly. In the same sense, a market for marijuana and LSD was first created in the United States by methods already described and then filled by British plutocrats and their American cousins with the help of the overlords of the British banking establishment. I think that's just better stated as international Jewry. I think that's probably the easiest way to state that. The lucrative drug trade is one of the worst examples of money making out of human misery. You mean aside from misery? But anyway. The other being the legal drug trade run by the pharmaceutical drug houses under the Rockefeller ownership. Okay, right. IBID, what I already talked about. All right, so I'm going to skip all that. American Medical Association. Yep. What they don't tell us. Sure. Okay, back to here. All right. So London Times never dared to tell us the British public that it was impossible to make vast profits from tea, nor did the illustrious paper even hint to a trade in opium being piled by those who spent their time in London's fashionable clubs or playing a chuka of polo at the Royal Windsor's Club, or the gentlemen officers who went out in India of the service of the empire were financed solely by the enormous income derived from the misery of the millions of Chinese coolies addicted to opium. Well, sure, that's how the British did things. And then, I don't know, how did we end up? Okay, let's put it this way. How did the same people that did it in England end up doing it in America? Okay, just go read one book. Go read War is a Racket. That'll pretty much explain it to you. So anyway, and if you want to watch a really good, not too long, little documentary, literally named War is a Racket, I highly suggest doing so on the VSOF platforms. It was a little lecture given by Ed Rivera, and he went through all of the history of wars and central banking, and it's a very good piece. I just highly suggest that everybody watch it. To understand that, we're talking now about the British side of things, but it happened here in America as well, as it does in every single other country that has a fucking central bank. So, you might want to think about that from the standpoint of, okay, when do things happen? Oh, it's when they set up a central bank. Oh, but when do things really happen? Oh, that's right. When a country says, fuck your central bank. I don't know, like Venezuela right now? Why do you think the CIA has decided to have a war, with Trump's permission, of course, against Venezuela? It's one of the last countries in the world that doesn't have a fucking Rothschild central bank in it. Okay. They also have some oil down there. So you don't want a country being, I don't know, autonomous, self-sufficient, not under the control of the Rothschilds, because when they actually slam down their slavery grid, they don't want any place in the world to run to. Zero. None. Zip. Zero. Zilch. Period. End of discussion. Have a nice day. That's why they have to take them all out. Right? Iraq was not all that hard. Libya was pretty easy. They just sent in some special agents, just whacked him. Of course, they let a bunch of American diplomats die, but, collateral damage to these filthy Luciferian fuckers. But this is how things are done. It's how it works. Smedley D. Butler will tell you, the gentleman that wrote The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, whose name escapes me, maybe Spectre, you remember. They'll tell you this is how it's done. And it's how it's been done since central banks were set up in European countries to originally start colonialism to begin with. That's how it started. That's how they did it. Okay. And nothing has changed since then at all. John Perkins. Thank you, Spectre. Yeah. Read John Perkins' book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, because in there he explains how corporations would pay him to go in and talk to foreign leaders and sometimes foreign presidents to say, hey, you might not want to do this anymore. We really don't want you to do this or that. And then if that didn't work, like subtle nudging, well, then, a member of their family might die. And if that didn't make him come around, then, they'd get into a small propped airplane and be handed a tape recorder before they got in and said, oh, listen to this, President. This is the newest, whatever. And of course, it'd be a CIA agent handing him the tape recorder. And then when he got up to a certain altitude, the thing had a little bomb in it and it would explode, taking out the whole plane. They did that to a lot of people. They did that to the president of Nicaragua. They did it to the president of Panama. They did it. Anyway, it's a long list, but that's what they do. They'll just whack you. And recently I've seen that the president down there right now that's starting to get attacked by the CIA basically went to his people and he said, do not let this monstrous creature CIA come in here and try and overthrow me and overthrow what we have here. And I think he's pretty intelligent for doing that, because it's way better off that they know beforehand about what's coming and then they have a chance to do something about it. Because the CIA has a really good track record of just running into countries, throwing millions of dollars all over the place to a whole bunch of people to make them quote unquote riot. And then they'll take all of their news cameras and point at all the riots. And then they'll broadcast that out to the rest of the country's TVs and be like, the whole country's rioting. When it was just only the people that got paid with the millions of dollars that they fucking gave them. A very good example of that, probably the best example of that, was when they took out Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, and Kermit Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, went in there with, I don't know, not all that much. I think like 250 million, wasn't all that much. And he did exactly that. Oh, look, they're rioting. Oh, they're rioting everywhere. Why'd they do that? It's because Mohammad Mossadegh said, we're going to pay the people of Iran a living wage out of the oil that we are selling to and out of our country. And we're also going to boot the people that are in here right now, meaning the oil companies, which would have been BP and Shell and probably Standard Oil at that time. Maybe not that far back. I don't remember when Standard Oil got broken up. I can't remember. But anyway, some other subsidiary of Rockefeller's fuckery. And so he did. And then Mohammad Mossadegh, stepped down, and then the CIA installed the Shah of Iran, set up SAVAK, which was one of the most dastardly secret service agencies to kill people and torture people that have ever existed in the entire world, for the exception of probably the Soviet fuckers and during the gulags of those days. But anyway, point is, modus operandi. What do? Go in with money, CIA, make riots, do whatever they need, maybe fuck up a little bit of infrastructure to make it look good, project the riots and say, this is what's happening, rile everybody else up, then say, oh, we're going to switch to quick elections, or we have to get this leader in. Okay, that's what they do every single time, right? So what they did then and what they're doing now hasn't changed, okay? Just a little bit of background history for all you guys. Okay, so where were we here? All right, to continue. They were so mighty, as Lord Bernard Russell once observed, quote, they could even give God advice when he had trouble in heaven. Nor should we imagine that anything has actually changed in the intervening years. Exactly the same attitude prevails today among members of the Committee of 300, which is why they often refer to themselves as the Olympians. I talked about how they corrupt those words. Later, the British Crown, i.e. the royal family, joined the British East India Company's trade and used it as a vehicle to produce opium in Bengal and elsewhere in India, controlling exports through what was called transit duties. That is, the Crown levied a tax on all producers of opium, duly registered with the state authority, who were sending their opium to China. Right. Why not? Why not take some tariffs, right? I mean, this is already what you're doing. Fuck it. Just tax the ships too while you're at it. Prior to 1896, when the trade was still illegal, a word used to extract greater tributes from the producers of opium, there never having been the slightest attempt to stop the trade. Colossal amounts of opium were shipped out of India on board Chinese tea clippers, those sailing ships around which legend and lore were built, but supposedly carried chests of tea from India to China to London exchanges. So audacious did the British East India Company lords and ladies become that they tried to sell this lethal substance to the Union and Confederate armies in pill form as a painkiller. I didn't know that one. Okay, there's a little bit of American history for you. Is it difficult to imagine what would have happened had their plan succeeded? All those hundreds of thousands of soldiers would have been left in battlefields totally hooked on opium. Quote unquote, the Beatles were much more successful in turning out millions of teenage addicts in later years. Bengal merchants and their British controllers and the bankers grew fat and intolerant on the enormous amounts of money that poured into the coffers of the British East India Company from their wretched Chinese coolies' opium trade. BEIC profits, even in those years, far exceeded the combined profits made in a single year by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler in their heydays. I'm sure they probably rivaled the profits of small countries, I would think. The trend in making huge profits out of drugs was carried over to the 1960s by such legal drug death merchants as Sandoz, the makers of LSD, and Hoffman L. Roche, manufacturers of Valium. Oh, how wonderful. The cost of the raw materials and manufacturing of Valium to Hoffman La Roche is $3 per kilo. It is sold to their distributors for $20,000 per kilo. By the time it reaches the customer, the price of Valium has risen to $50,000 per kilo. Yeah. See, like I said, talk about legal drug trade. Shit, get out of here. Don't even try in front. Valium is used in huge quantities in Europe and in the United States. It is possibly the most used drug of its kind in the world. Hoffman La Roche does the same thing with vitamin C, which costs them less than a cent a kilo to produce. Well, if anybody has any brains, don't get vitamin C from one of these idiots. Just get it from somebody that's holistic and is actually processing it from things and natural substances that have been tested, aren't irradiated, aren't filled with chemicals or anything else. Just make sure your stuff's clean, okay? It is sold for, I'm not even going to read that common law. It is sold for a profit of 10,000%. When a friend of mine blew the whistle on this criminal company, which had entered into a monopoly agreement with other producers in contravention of European Economic Community laws. He was arrested on the Swiss-Italian border and hustled into prison. His wife was threatened by the Swiss police until she committed suicide. As a British national, he was rescued by the British consul in Bern as soon as word of his plight was received, removed from prison, and flown out of the country. Right. He lost his wife, his job, and his pension because he dared to disclose Hoffmann LaRouche secrets. Right. The Swiss take their industrial espionage law very seriously. Well, as they should when they're dealing with drug traffickers. Remember, this is the time you see those lovely advertisements of Swiss ski poles, beautiful watches, pristine mountains, and cuckoo clocks. That is not what Switzerland is about. It is about dirty, multi-billion-dollar money laundering, which is careened out of major Swiss banking houses. True. Which is why the Swiss are always neutral in every war and why it's pretty much a Rothschild-owned country. Not all that different than, say, I don't know, Israel. It is about the Committee of 300 illegal drug manufacturers. Why do I keep making Freudian slips? Okay. It is about the Committee of 300 legal drug manufacturers. Switzerland is the committee's ultimate safe haven for money and protection for their bodies in time of global calamity. Now, mind you, one could get into serious trouble with the Swiss authorities for giving out any information on these nefarious activities. The Swiss regard it as industrial espionage, which actually carries a 5-year prison term. It is safer to pretend that Switzerland is a nice, clean country, rather than look under the covers or inside its garbage can banks. True. You want to say something somewhere and you want to hide it somewhere? Go put it in a Swiss bank account. In 1931, the managing directors of the so-called Big Five British companies were rewarded by being made peers of the realm for the activities in drug money laundering. Who decided such matters and bestowed such honors? It is the Queen of England King now, who bestows such honors upon men in top positions in the drug trade. Right. British banks engaged in this terrible trade are too numerous to mention, but a few of the top ones are the British Bank of the Middle East, Midland Bank, National and Westminster Bank, Barclays Bank, I think that's a really big one, Royal Bank of Canada, no surprise there, Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, Baring Brothers Bank, and they're definitely missing one because it would have came later. USBC was definitely the one that had a ridiculous amount found of drug money that they were laundering through it. But anyway. Okay, so many of the merchant banks are up in their hocks in pig swells, drug trade traffic profits. Banks such as Harmbos, for example, run by Sir Jack and Harborough. For a really interesting major study of the Chinese opium trade, one would need access to India office in London. I was able to get in there because of my intelligence service and received great assistance from the trustee of the papers of the late Professor Frederick Wells Williamson. Fascinating. Which provided much information on the opium trade carried on by the British East India Company in India and China in the 18th and 19th centuries. Wow, that's... Okay, so yeah, this guy definitely had some really good backdoor connections because that's not something you just wander into. So I think Dr. Coleman definitely had his inside track here. If only those papers could be made public, what a storm would burst over the heads of the crowded vipers of Europe. Today, the trade has shifted somewhat in that less expensive cocaine has taken over a good part of North America market. In the 1960s, the flood of heroin coming from Hong Kong, Lebanon, Dubai threatened to engulf the United States and Western Europe. When demand outpaced supply, there was a switch to cocaine. But now, at the end of 1991, that trend has been reversed. Today, it is heroin that is back in favor. Although it is true that cocaine still enjoys great favor among the poorer classes. Really? I would reverse that, but okay. I'll go along with it. Heroin, we are told, is more satisfying to addicts. The effects are far more intense and last longer than the effects of cocaine. Okay, true. And there is less international attention on heroin producers than there is on Colombian cocaine shippers. Also true. Because who are the international heroin producers? All these old families that no one's going to touch. Besides which, it is hardly likely that the U.S. would make any real effort to stop the production of opium in the Golden Triangle, which is under the control of the Chinese military. A serious war would erupt if any country tried to interdict the trade. A serious attack on the opium trade would bring Chinese military intervention. Huh. Let me think about that one for a second. Okay. So the Canaanites went in, created communist China. They were already there anyway, running the opium trade. Okay, so all right, that's what they did. So they went in there, they did the opium. I'm just like literally in real time thinking out world history here because I'm starting to make some connections that I never thought about before. So Canaanites go in, do the opium war with China, get that going, get that set up, totally control it. They keep them under the bus all the way until they're able to establish communism in China, which is just a more complete system of control to get rid of any potential problems that might still pop their ugly heads up in a country of which you want to be the absolute dictators of. And then they have the Chinese military protect that same trade. Right, because why would they want to use their merchant vessels? Yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, so the merchant vessels are then protected by the military in international waters. Right, got it. Okay, anyway, to continue, I was just piecing things together here. Okay, all right, so the British know this. They have no quarrel with China except for an occasional squabble over who gets the larger share of the pie. Britain has been involved in the China opium trade for 2 centuries. No one is going to be so foolish as to rock the boat when millions upon millions of dollars flow into the bank accounts of the British oligarchs, and more gold is traded on Hong Kong gold market than the combined total traded in London and New York. Those individuals who finally imagine that they can do some kind of deal with a major Chinese or Burmese overlord in their hills of the Golden Triangle apparently have no idea of what is involved. If they had known, they would have never talked about stopping the opium trade. Such talk reveals little knowledge of the immensity and complexity of Chinese opium trade. British plutocrats, the Russian KGB, Dope Incorporated, also known as the CIA, and the United States. Bankers are all in league with China. Could one man stop or even make a small dent in the trade? It would be absurd to imagine it. What is heroin and why is it favored over cocaine these days? According to the noted authority on the subject, Professor Galen, heroin is a derivative of opium, a drug that stupefies the senses and induces long periods of sleep. This is what most addicts like. It is called, quote, being in the arms of Morpheus. Yeah, I've also heard it called that it feels like a big warm hug, I guess. The only time I ever took opiates was because I got prescribed them for pills for some damn thing I did. I don't even remember. And I took them and I was like, my God, why does anybody like this? It was just the most horrible feeling. I felt like dumb and I felt lazy and I felt literally like a blanket had been put over me that I couldn't take off. And it was very annoying. And I'm just like, screw it. I'm just going to suffer through the pain. It's not that bad anyway. It's certainly better than taking this shit. And at the end, when you like come off of it, it's like you get these like weird freaking like tingles and shit like in your hands. It's very annoying. Anyway, the whole experience was horrible. And I'm like, I don't know why anybody would ever do opium. It's beyond me. No idea. But anyway, so to continue, many pharmaceutical drugs contain opium in various degrees. It is believed that paper used in the manufacture of cigarettes is first impregnated with opium. Are you shitting me? Okay, whatever. Which is why smokers become so addicted to their habit. The poppy seed from which it is derived was long known to the Mongols of India, who used the seeds mixed in tea offered to a difficult opponent. It is also used as a pain-killing drug, which largely replaced chloroform and other older anesthetics of the bygone era. Opium was popular in all of the fashionable clubs of Victoria, London, and it was no secret that men like the Huxley brothers, used it extensively. Oh, I didn't know that. No surprise based upon their book writings. Members of the Orphic Dionysus cults of Hellenic Greece and Osiris Horus cults of Ptolemaic Egypt. Yeah, there you go. All right, so now we're actually getting to the fucking root of these cocksuckers. These are what the real deal are. I'm just going to put that in red so that when anybody downloads this, they'll stop and make a point to look at this. You should look into these things. The cult of Dionysus is Hollywood, okay? The cult of Horus and the Atonists, right? The all-seeing eye, right? The aspect of what that is, the understanding of the pineal gland, adrenochrome, okay? That's those cocksuckers, right? So to put these two together, yeah. People should know this. Which, when Victoria's society embraced all smoked opium, it was the in thing to do. So do some of those who met at St. Ermin's Hotel in 1903 to decide what sort of world we would have. The descendants of the St. Ermin's crowd are found today in the Committee of 300. It is these so-called world leaders who brought about such a change in our environment that enabled drug usage to proliferate to the point where it can no longer be stopped by regular law enforcement tactics and policies. Of course, it's perpetuated by them. One of their favorites was the writer, I'm just going to say Quigley, I'm going to try and pronounce the first part of that, who wrote a book in 1932 entitled Revolution Through Technology, which was a blueprint for the return of the world to a medieval society. Didn't these fuckers try that in the Dark Ages? Could have fooled me. The book, in fact, became a working paper for the Committee of 300 plan to deindustrialize the world, starting with the United States, claiming that pressures of overpopulation are a serious problem. Okay, that's why this name sounded familiar. Yeah, the Kalergi plan. Okay, he's referred to the Kalergi plan several times previous. Okay, got it. Advised a return to what he called open spaces. Right, which is exactly what the Georgia Guidestones were about, right? Reduce the population of the planet to under, I think it said 400 million, or whatever the hell, in perpetual balance with nature. And then somebody said, I don't like that. And they blew that fucking thing up, thank God. But anyway, they always tell you what you're going to do before they're going to do it, okay? So does this sound like the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot? True. Here are some extracts from the book. Quote, in its facilities, the city of the future will resemble the city of the Middle Ages. And he who is not condemned to live in a city because of his occupation will go to the countryside. Our civilization is a culture of the major cities. Therefore, it is a marsh plant, born by degenerated, sickly, and decadent people who have voluntarily or involuntarily ended up in this dead-end street of life. Isn't that very close to what Angkor Wat gave as, quote-unquote, his reasons for depopulating Phnom Penh? Don't know that story, but I'll take the author's word for it. The first opium shipments reached England from Bengal in 1683. Huh. Okay. All right, now I got a time frame. I didn't think it was that early, but all right. Carried in the British East India Company tea clippers, opium was brought to England as a test, an experiment, to see whether the common folk of England, the yeomen and the lower classes, would be induced into taking the drug. It was what we could call today test marketing of a new product. But the sturdy yeomen and the much derided lower classes were made of stern stuff, and the test marketing experiment was a total flop. The lower classes of British society firmly rejected opium smoking. Well, good for them. The plutocrats and oligarchists in high society in London began casting about for a market that would not be so resistant, so unbending. They found such a market in China. In the papers I studied in the India office under the heading of miscellaneous old records, I found all the confirmation I would have wished for in proving that the opium trade in China really took off following the founding of the British East India Company-funded China Inland Mission, ostensibly a Christian missionary society, but in reality, the promotion, men and women, for the new product being introduced into the market, that new product being opium. This was later confirmed when I was given access to the papers of Sir George Birdwood in an Indian office records. Soon after the China Inland Mission missionaries set out to give away their sample packages and show the coolies how to smoke opium, vast quantities of the opium began to arrive in China. Quote unquote, the Beatles could not have done a better job. In both cases, the trade was sanctioned by the British royal family, who openly supported the Beatles. Where the British East India Company had failed in England, it now succeeded beyond its wildest expectations in China, whose teeming millions of poor looked upon smoking opium as an escape from their life of misery. Okay. I think I'm going to skip some of the history of the opium wars in China because we kind of know what happened. I just want to get to more aspects of they did later. Okay, still opium. Okay, let's check this. The Chinese had passed a law, the Yongqing Edict of 1729, forbidding the importation of opium. Yet the BEIC managed to keep opium as an entry into the Chinese customs tariffs books until 1753. Okay, that's several decades after the law was passed. The duty being 3 talis per chest of opium. Even when British Special Secret Service, the 007 of the day, saw to it that troublesome Chinese officials were bought off, and in cases that was not possible, they were simply murdered. Every British monarch since 1729 has benefited immensely from the drug trade, and this holds good for the present occupant of the throne, which now would be the king. Their ministers saw to it that wealth flowed into the family's coffers. One such minister of Victoria's was Lord Palmerston. He clung obsessively to the belief that nothing should be allowed to stop Britain's opium trade with China. Of course, why not? Palmerston's plan was to supply Chinese government with enough opium to make individual members become greedy. Sure. Then the British would withhold supplies when the Chinese government was on its knees. Supplies would be resumed, but at a much higher price, thus retaining a monopoly through the Chinese government itself. But the plan failed. The Chinese government responded by destroying large cargoes of opium stored in its warehouses, and British merchants were required to sign individual agreements not to import any more opium into Canton. Right. That's a good way to do it. Spy says that Huntress says laudanum was heavily prescribed in the 19th century England as an opiate. That's true. Laudanum also did make its way in America as well. I know that you could get laudanum at pretty much every drugstore that you wanted to in basically the Wild West days, if you will. I don't know I don't know when it got here. Well, okay. So they said earlier that they tried to bring it here and tried to give it to American soldiers, but I do know that it was prevalent in the 1800s. Let's just put it that way, particularly after the Civil War and probably during the Civil War too, truth be told. You could pretty much find it at every drugstore. So yeah, that's kind of how they brought it in the back door in America. So yes, I totally know what Huntress is talking about. Okay, to continue. BEIC responded by sending scores of fully loaded heroin carrying ships to lie in the roads of Macau. Companies beholden to BEIC rather than individuals then sold these cargoes. Chinese Commissioner Lin said, quote, "There is so much opium on board English vessels now lying in the roads of this place, Macau, which will never be returned to the country from which it came, and I shall not be surprised to hear of it being smuggled in under American colors." Right. Well, there we go. Full circle. Lin's prophecy proved to be remarkably accurate. The opium wars against China were designed to, quote, put the Chinese in their place, as Lord Palmerston once said, and the Great British Army did that. There was simply no stopping the vast lucrative trade which provided the British oligarchical feudal lords with untold billions, while leaving China with millions of opium addicts. In later years, the Chinese appealed to Britain for help with their immense problem and received it. Thereafter, respective Chinese governments realized the value in cooperating instead of fighting with Britain, and this held good during the bloody rule of Mao Zedong. So that today, as I have already mentioned, any quarrels that come about are only ever the share of the opium trade each is entitled. Okay, what did I say earlier in my brainstorming? I hadn't read this yet. I had no idea. I was just brainstorming and figuring out, all right, how did they do this? Like thinking about current time, what would have happened. That's exactly what they did. Exactly what I said. See what just pure raw reason will get you sometimes. All right, to continue. To advance to more modern history, the Chinese-British partnership was solidified by the Hong Kong Agreement, which established an equal partnership in the opium trade. This has proceeded smoothly, with an occasional ripple here and there. But while violence and death, robbery and murder marked the progression of the Colombian cocaine trade, no such baseness was allowed to disturb the heroin trade, which, as I said earlier, is once again coming into the ascendancy as we near the end of 1991. D. Roper said maybe that's why they threw the tea into the Boston Harbor, help it get back from whence it came. Well, yeah. The Americans, in doing that, were well aware of the monopoly aspect of the control that the Canaanites and Luciferian filth had over these trading companies, right? They're well aware that that's what they did. They're well aware that that was always a monopoly. In fact, one of the biggest proponents of that, who was actually a ship owner, was John Hancock. John Hancock was fucking pissed as to what the British East India Company was doing. And was one of the main reasons why he was the president of the Continental Congress, which also a lot of people don't know. Because he was just absolutely tired of it. He's like, enough is enough. They're killing us with monopoly. They're going to kill us physically. Let's just, be done with this. So yeah, it makes perfect sense that they did that for the exact same reasons. I completely agree with you. All right, so to continue. The British oligarchical families of the Committee of 300, who were entrenched in Canton at the height of the opium trade, left their descendants in position. Right. Again, this is fools following fools, right? Look at the list of prominent British residents in China, and you will see the names of members of the Committee of 300 among them. The same holds good for Hong Kong. These plutocrats are of a feudal era that they seek to return to the world, control the gold and opium trade, of which Hong Kong is the center. Yeah. So it never really did matter who controlled Hong Kong, the Chinese or the British. They didn't really give a shit because they were getting along with each other, supposedly. So anyway, Burmese and Chinese opium poppy growers get paid in gold. They do not trust the U.S. paper $100 bill. Well, it's good for them, I guess, whatever. This explains the very large volume of gold trade in the Hong Kong exchange. The Golden Triangle is no longer the largest producer of opium. That dubious title has since 1987 been shared by the Golden Crescent, Iran, Pakistan, and Lebanon. And I would say in some short years after that, it probably moved to Afghanistan. I don't know. Maybe Pakistan and Lebanon and Iran did still grow more. I don't know. We always hear about it coming out of Afghanistan. So the reason I mentioned it. But anyway. All right, to continue. These are the principal opium producers, although smaller quantities are once again coming out of Afghanistan and Turkey. Okay, what I just said. The drug trade and more, especially the opium trade, could not function without the help of banks, as we shall demonstrate as we proceed. How do banks with their great air of respectability fit into the drug trade with all of its ascendant filth? Is a very long and complicated story, which could be the subject of a book on its own. One way in which the banks participate by financing front companies importing the chemicals needed to produce raw opium into heroin. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, with its branch office in London, is right in the middle of such trade through a company called, not even going to try it, which banks with Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. What does this company do? It imports into Hong Kong most of the chemicals needed in the heroin refining process. It is also a major supplier of arsenic anhydride for the Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle, Pakistan, Turkey, and Lebanon. The actual financing of this trading is hived off the Bangkok Metropolitan Bank. Thus, the secondary activities connected with processing opium, while not in the same category, use the opium trade, nevertheless generate substantial income for banks. But the real income of Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and indeed all banks in the region, is financing the actual opium trade. It took a lot of research on my part to link the price of gold to the price of opium. I used to tell everyone who would listen, if you want to know the price of gold, find out what the price of a pound of kilo of opium is in Hong Kong. To my critics, I answered, take a look at what happened in 1977, a critical year for gold. The Bank of China shocked the gold pundits and those clever forecasters, who are to be found in great numbers in America, by suddenly, and without warning, dumping 80 tons of gold on the market. That depressed the price of gold in a big hurry. All the experts could say was, quote, we never knew China had that much gold. Where could it have come from? Stupid sentences like this remind me of ignorant musings from retards like Kramer, right? You're not supposed to know, idiot. You're just a mouthpiece. Shut up and go back and do what you're told. It came from the gold which was paid to China in the Hong Kong gold market for large purchases of opium. The current policy of the Chinese government towards England is the same as it was in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Chinese economy, tied to the economy of Hong Kong, and I don't mean television sets, textiles, radios, watches, pirated cassette tapes, and videotapes. I mean opium, heroin. Would take a terrible beating if it were not for the opium trade it shares with Britain. The BEIC is gone, but the descendants of the Council of 300 linger on in the membership of the Committee of 300. The oldest of the oligarchical British families who were leaders of the opium trade for the past 200 years are still in it today. Take the Mathesons, for instance. This noble family is one of the pioneers of the opium trade. While things looked a bit shaky a few years ago, the Mathesons stepped in and gave China a loan of $300 million for real estate investments. Actually, it was billed as a joint venture between the People's Republic of China and Matheson Bank. Oh, okay. Okay, I'm making another connection now. That's why there's all these ridiculous projects and shit in China that always like get made. Like these huge, enormous projects, they get made and nobody ever uses them. It's because they've got to launder their stupid dope money somewhere. That's what they're doing. Okay, anyway, just made another connection, but to continue. When researching Indian office papers in the 1700s, I came across the name of Matheson, and it kept on cropping up everywhere. London, Peking, Dubai, Hong Kong, wherever heroin and opium were mentioned. The problem with the drug trade, it has become a threat to national sovereignty. Here's what the Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations said about this worldwide threat. So even Venezuela was pissing everybody off back then even. Quote, the problem of drugs has already ceased to be dealt with simply as one of the public health or social problem. It has turned into something far more serious and far-reaching, which affects our national sovereignty. A problem of national security because it strikes at the independence of a nation. Drugs in all their manifestations of production, commercialization, and consumption denaturalizes us by injuring our ethical, religious, and political life, our historic, economic, and Republican values. This is precisely why the Bank of the International Settlements and the IMF are operating. Ta-da! There we go. There's a real connection for you. Uh-huh. Yeah, dope money needs to be reinvested to make better meth. Exactly, Spy. Let me say without hesitation that both these banks are nothing more than bully boy clearinghouses for the drug trade. True. Yeah, the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF are the center of the problem. They always have been. Because that's where you have world Jewry controlling everything. They control everything through the central banks. So then they can just, shuffle the money between them. And the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF can have what's called their special drawing rights. See, countries get special drawing rights from the IMF, in case nobody knows how this works. So one day I woke up and I said, what the fuck are they drawing off of? And so I did a little bit of research, and what the IMF special drawing rights are is that they are drawing off of your registered, abandoned infant estate. It's the productive value of your existence that these corporations pretending to be governments, like the United States and Canada and everything else, are saying, hey, IMF, we'll give you all this registered people with all their productive value. Can you give us special drawing rights now? That's what they're doing. They're getting money from daddy because they're warehousing the infants of which the monetary policy itself, meaning the debt, the creation of the money itself, the debt money, not real money because real money is gold and silver, but their creation and their hypothecation of it comes from that. That's what the special drawing rights are. Okay? Very important to understand this because it connects into how everything that we do at the Vocational Science of Freedom is done to remove you from this fucking system. You have to claim your estate. You have to do things properly at law, which means common law, in the way that they used to be done back when they actually used to be done. Meaning in the Court of Wards and Liveries, which ran from the late 1500s to the mid 1600s, where the infants or those people had to go and sue out their livery. And everybody had to do this. It's not that oligarchs were immune from it. They did it too, right? You had to go and sue out your livery. You had to do a proof of age inquest to prove that you have come of age. So what? So you could hold your title to your estate. Your estate, the substantive definition thereof, is everything that a man or woman owns at law. That's your estate. Might be land, might just be your body. Doesn't matter. You don't get it unless you suit out your livery. Problem is that America got put under this old medieval slavery system, and we've been subjected to Roman civil law, statutes, acts, and codes, and all this equity bullshit, meaning all the contracts and pledges and bonds and oaths and fuckery of the attorney. But nobody ever told us that there was a remedy. Why? Because they don't want us to have one. Well, sorry, there is one. And the Vocational Science of Freedom is the only place you can find it. So with that, I'm going to just quickly check Mega Chat. And in case anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them. Now's the time. D. Roper said that date, 1977, when China dumped gold, seems it could have been relating for when the U.S. avoided Hong Kong and took part in the heroin opium trade via U.S. plans, leaving Vietnam. Claiming to be reparating soldiers killed in action. Could be. I could see how that would be possible. Yeah. Spectre says it's not going to be long before the BRICS consortium starts dictating the price of gold and silver as well. That's true. Yeah, because the whole system's crashing right now. I mean, we're literally witnessing it. So we'll see how it pulls apart. I think the globalists are obviously going to keep control of the system. They're just going to break it into different sections, basically, is how I see it. But anyway, none of that should really concern any of us, particularly ones that are out. Once you get your vocational science freedom status doc set, you don't have to worry about this filthy shit anymore. You are done with them. And you can tell the United States Federal Corporation to fuck off too. All right, so I'm going to make a note here where we stopped in our glorious little nasty banking place. And for everyone's notice, if you'd like to join the Vocational Science Freedom, you can go to vocationalscienceoffreedom.org and click on the Welcome Package, and then come down here and download the Welcome Package, and you'll fill it out and set up your communications with us. That way you can join Mega, and you can get some of the part of the Vocational Science Freedom Online Members Library and enjoy all of the books that I have collected over my long time of doing this. And you can also join us on Wednesday night roundtables, which we have at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. That'd be 5 o'clock on Pacific, where we talk about anything we want to. There is no holds barred when it comes to Wednesday night roundtables. And if you join up with the VSOF, you can get access to all of our previous Wednesday night roundtables as well, if you'd like to go back into the archives and take a listen. But you first have to get vetted, because I don't allow CIA spooks, retards, agents, or any bit of that fuckery in the Vocational Science of Freedom. So with that, I'll see VSOF members on Wednesday. Everybody else, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Everyone that joined on both platforms. Now there's 3, technically. Now we have FTJ, we have Rumble, and we have Odyssey. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming. And one last little spidget of information. The VSOF is now also on X, which I just set up literally today. So the VSOF is on X, and that is VSOF on X. So it's x.com/VSOF on X. And I'll just make sure that I throw this into all of the show notes. It'll be in there along with all of the rest of the links to every place else that we are. But I'm just going to give it out to everybody now just so they have it. But I'll make sure that it's also in the show notes as well. So come join. I will be destroying communists, teaching people law, and educating people on how the hell we got here. So, all right. Hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And until next time, as always, stay safe and stay sovereign.